Weird Realities explores the paranormal, preternatural, and supernatural worlds that surround us. Here we delve into those topics that challenge us to think outside the limitations of realism, where we test the boundaries of imagination and are forced to think outside the confines and restrictions of what is normal. We are the creators, the writers, the artists, and the insane. Welcome to our Weird Realities.
All right. Hello, my weird friends. This is Morgana Calder with my co-host, Joseph Hansen. And tonight we have with us Miss Varla Ventura. She has multiple books. She has on one called Paranormal Parlor, Ghost Seances and Tales of True Hauntings. And then she has Fairies, Pookas, and Changelings, a complete guide to the wild and wicked enchanted realm. And some really cool, you've got a couple of books on bizarre, that are awesome. So we're going to be talking tonight about some ladies that have made an impact, in the paranormal world. And who knows where we'll go from there. It's so good to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Sounds good to me.
All right. Great.
My kind of night.
Okay. Yes. I love these too. So, all right. Like I said, there's a lot we could go with. I think I'll just start with, back in Victorian England, specifically in London in the late 1800s, it was really active for the spiritualist movement. Secret societies, cults, beliefs in contacting the dead, practice of magic, and that type of stuff. And it's like the mindset shifted from a cult being malevolent to it was almost a science, and it was more acceptable in that time. And like I said, it started opening up areas where women had a better chance of participating, because back then it was still very limited in careers and things they could do outside the home. So with that said, is there someone in particular that, you really think of that time period and that has an impact?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's quite a few. And actually simultaneous with the spiritualist movement in England, there was a pretty rampant spiritualist movement happening in the United States. Mm-hmm. It started in about 1840 and continued. I mean, there are still spiritualists today, and there are spiritualist communities, mm-hmm. But it really kind of petered out in like the late 20s, early 30s. But one of the things in the U.S. that really kind of ramped it up was the Civil War and the sort of post-war mourning and people's desperation and grief to try and connect with the other side. You also had, Mary Todd Lincoln in the White House, who had lost her son and was known to have seances to try and contact, I believe his name was William. So there were quite. So when you have a figurehead like that doing it, you're absolutely right. It became more of a common household practice than something that you would kind of was reserved for the alchemists in their towers. Mm-hmm. And actually, that's kind of the title of my book is Paranormal Parlor, and that sort of is what the Paranormal Parlor is and was. It was that sort of Victorian parlor of the well-to-do who would entertain and have these seances. Mm-hmm. And so one of my favorite stories actually took place in St. Louis, and it was about 1915. And there were two women. So you really touched on something important there, because if you think of Victorian England, Victorian United States, and kind of what was allowed to women throughout, you couldn't even vote, right? So up right. through the 20s in particular. So what was allowed to women? Okay, so you could be a school teacher, but you probably were only going to do that for a while until you married. And if you kept doing it, you were a spinster. You could be go into service and, work for a household. You could marry well. You could have been born into money and therefore just sort of, be wealthy, and you were expected, of course, to marry well again. You could go into prostitution. You could go into theater, which was essentially viewed in many ways as a form of prostitution. So, your options were kind of limited. And there were many, many women who wanted to write and be successful. And we know from, the likes of George Eliot that women frequently would write under pen names, male or sort of gender neutral pen names.
Right.
So there was a woman, her name is Emily Grant Hutchings, and she became part of the spiritualist movement. In about 1915, she attended a seance. She actually brought a friend of hers to this seance, and her friend was named Pearl Curran. And Pearl Curran is probably one of the best known spiritualist writers, certainly of the time. She had quite a bit of success channeling an entity known as Patience Worth. And she had books published. She had novels published. She said she just got these divine messages and she used automatic writing, and that she was sort of the conduit for Patience Worth. And Patience wrote volumes of poetry and little novellas, and was actually very well received. In fact, was even poet laureate for a while, I think just in the state of Missouri. So they were friends, Patience and Emily. Emily was quite a bit younger than Patience, and they went to this seance together. And, than Pearl. Her name was Pearl, not Patience. So they were friends. They went to the seance together. And at this seance, the way the story goes is that a medium said, "Oh, she's the one. She's the scribe." And it turned out that the medium was purporting to channel the ghost of Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain. This was about 4 years after he died. And essentially what happened is Emily, this medium, and occasionally Emily's husband eventually got involved. They channeled a novel, or claimed to channel a novel, via the Ouija board, painstakingly going into session, and the husband would take notes, or Emily would take notes after, and they would write this entire novel, which is a decent length novel. I've read it, channeled via the Ouija board. And the story itself is just pretty, that in itself is pretty remarkable, that they would go to these lengths. Of course, we don't know for sure if this was just an elaborate publicity stunt to get people to buy the book, or if it was legitimately something very mystical that was happening, or maybe they were channeling someone else. But in the introduction to the book, Emily talks about how they had to fashion this Ouija board, a spirit board, into a typewriter, essentially. So Twain's ghost got tired of having to write out parenthetical statement, and he had them, so they fashioned a semicolon and parentheses marks on the board. And so you kind of imagine this, I just love that imagery of sort of like a spirit board typewriter, a typewriter for ghosts.
Yeah.
So the story continues because they put this story out, and one of the things that the title is Jap Heron. And it's a story about a young kid named Jasper who apprentices with a newspaperman. And it's very grammatically driven, and there's a lot of inside jokes, and it has a Twain-esque element to it. Now, I'm not a huge Twain scholar or fan, but if you told me this was Twain and I didn't know any of this channeling stuff, I probably would believe that it was something he had written. But of course, he had a very distinctive style, not impossible to mimic, right? So I'm always kind of thinking like one side, the other side, one side, the other side. So she finds a publisher. There's a fairly well-known fairly well-known publisher who publishes things of the esoteric nature, and it goes to print. In the beginning of the book, it says Jap Heron, a novel. I think it's a novel translated via Ouija, I think is what it says. But it actually has a picture of Mark Twain on the frontispiece, and it says the name Mark Twain somewhere in the subtitle, I believe. So Samuel Clemens' daughter and his publisher got wind of this and sent a cease and desist to the publisher of Emily's book. And they took it to court. Emily claiming all along this was a legitimate work that had been channeled, and the publisher saying it doesn't really matter. We own the name Mark Twain. We own the copyright. And so it ended up actually making it all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was ruled against the publisher of Emily's work for copyright infringement, not because she had claimed that it was the ghost of Mark Twain, but because she had used his name, and that pen name was owned by the estate of Mark Twain and the publishing house. So they ordered it destroyed. It was, expunged from all of the stores and stands, and supposedly all the copies were destroyed, although we know for sure they weren't all destroyed, because if you go to Gutenberg, which is a wonderful online resource for public domain works, there's a scanned facsimile of the actual book. So we know the book saw the light of day and a few people stashed it. And one of these days, I swear I'm going to be in an old moldy bookstore and I'm going to find it and I'm going to cry.
Yes.
So the whole kind of story, there's more to it. Honestly, I could have written a book just on Emily's story because there's more to it. There's actual evidence, I think, in the UC Berkeley archives that Emily and Mark Twain had an exchange. I believe she traveled to San Francisco and attended some seminars. She was a would-be journalist, an aspiring journalist, and sought some advice from him. So there were a lot of theories about, of course, someone threw out the theory that she had been sort of jilted by him. I reject that theory because I feel like that's a very sort of patriarchal view of how a woman might become successful. So I reject that one immediately. But I mean, it's, fair enough to make that point. And there's just all kinds of other little sidebar stories that go along with that. But in the end, I even found in, I believe it was in an old newspaper in New York, I found the article that said something like, Ouija board goes to the Supreme Court, or psychic arts go to the Supreme Court, or something like that. And you can see the actual little article about this kind of incredible case that I personally hadn't heard of until a few years ago. When I was researching the book, it's actually the story that kind of set me in the path of writing this book, because it was such an interesting story, and I knew that there were others. And so I ended up, it's just one thing led to another. And like I said, there could be a whole book just on, and many people have written as well about the women of the spiritualist movement, but Emily is one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I would think you would put out quite a number on that too, because you've traveled the world pretty much studying and researching this, correct?
I have, yes. Wherever I go, I look for these
dedicated a lot of your life learning this craft and learning about other people and other versions of this craft and many varieties of it, and what people consider to be this. What do people consider? Some people consider it spiritualism, others consider it the occult. To me, I would see it as a thirst to know, a thirst of knowledge.
And yes, and that is how many of the spiritualists looked at it, because kind of as Morgana touched on in the beginning, it was not necessarily viewed as a good versus evil kind of situation. You could very well attend a seance or host a seance in your house and go to church the next day. It wasn't considered the opposite of Christianity necessarily. And
so, not meaning to interrupt, I'm just kind of curious. I want to clarify. You're into the past life, the spirits of people who used to exist. You're not into the study of demons or necromancy or anything like that. You're just in touch with the spiritual world.
Oh, I'm not opposed to demons and necromancy. mean, I dabble, I dabble a little.
We're writers here, so I'm sure we've all dabbled in the demons.
Yeah. Well, and I actually have worked.
But I hear you speak, and you seem to be very, very focused on the spiritual and past lives and people who have occupied this world, and
Well, I think that the women of these kind of the psychic arts and the way that the psychic arts opened up a different direction for women is definitely a very interesting aspect of occult history.
I feel women are more in touch with it than men are. I really do.
Well, it's very interesting because the other thing that came along with that time was the suffragists and the abolitionists were also frequently spiritualists, and there were several households, including Emily and it's Amy and Isaac Post, I believe, were their names, and they were kind of located just outside of Boston. He went on to become a pretty successful spiritualist writer, but they regularly hosted salons, and they had Susan B. Anthony, they had the Fox sisters, who are some of the most well-known spiritualists at the time, and they had Frederick Douglass speak. So there was a sort of community there of an expansive open-mindedness that spiritualism was part of.
And wasn't there the lady, I think her name was Britain, maybe? She did speeches and stuff while in trance.
So there is one woman that I know of that was extensively investigated. And she not only did she do, I mean, there are like literally dozens and dozens of these kinds of stories, and they're all pretty incredible. But this woman, her name was, I'm just going to look it up really quickly in my book. But what's her name? It's the investigation of. She's a very well-to-do Victorian woman, and she was investigated by the Society for Psychical Research for about 15 years. They tried to disprove that this woman was actually who she said she was. And they would do things like she would drop into trance, and they would stab pins under her fingers and all kinds of crazy things that they would do. And they still hadn't, after 10 years, had not been able to prove that she was not actually experiencing the channeling. She would go into other languages. Gosh, I cannot believe I've just forgotten the name of her. So I'm just going to open it up here.
The reason I can remember the Britain woman was because when I was in my late teens, I really got deep into Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, and she was one of the founders with Blavatsky.
Oh, yes.
And, yeah, that was I just remember her going into trances and doing like speeches in front of big crowds and stuff like that.
Okay. Oh, it's her. Okay. So her name was Leonora Piper.
Okay.
And the way that I read about her was Mrs. Piper and the Society for Cyclical Research. And basically, starting in, I believe they started in 1904 or so, the Society for Cyclical Research, of which does still exist, and there were different chapters. There was one in England and one in the United States, and their job was kind of to debunk anyone who was faking it, and they were especially important after the Fox sisters were shown to be charlatans, because that really damaged the spiritualist movement and the idea that people were making legitimate contact. So the Society for Cyclical Research was sort of set out to legitimize some of these people who were claiming to go into trance and channel beings and things like that. And this woman, Leonora Piper, she was in her 30s. She had a brain tumor, which she survived. And after being diagnosed, she began to drop into numerous trances. And she would channel Napoleon. She would channel all manner of Julius Caesar, a young French girl, all different, an Italian dictator, like all of these different personalities. and she would drop into trance and she would drop into these languages. She claimed she had no knowledge of these languages outside of the trance, that she had never learned them, and that she didn't really know much about these people. And she would speak in dialects, and they just repeatedly investigated her as they would anyone that was making these claims, and was kind of Mrs. Piper was not necessarily making a lot of money out of this, but she was dropping into trance, and people would come to see her and pay a couple bucks at the door, of course. Mm-hmm. And so, it just went on. It actually went on for 15 years. And after 15 years of jamming things under her fingernails and trying to trip her up and ask her questions, she never once faltered. So either she was some kind of savant and was unable, it was impossible to catch her up, or she was legitimately going into trance and channeling these different people. And actually, interestingly enough, I was just listening to something earlier today about how Houdini was really, he spent a lot of time trying to disprove a lot of these sort of spiritualist charlatans.
I remember that about
Yes, and it mattered so much to him that anything that was happening was actually authentic. And what I was listening to actually earlier was a podcast called Criminal, and she was talking about how Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Houdini were friends, but then they fell on the opposite side of the belief in spiritualism and channeling, and it actually caused a rift between them, and they their friendship fell apart because of it.
Yeah, because Doyle was deep into it.
Didn't Houdini once say that if he would prove it after he died because he would come back?
So Houdini, he died. So I actually did not know this until today, but he died on Halloween. I don't know if you guys knew that.
Yep.
He died on October 31st. And what he had done is while he was continually disproving, because he knew all the tricks, he also never stopped looking. And right. He apparently what he did is he said to numerous people, his wife included, that he would, if it was possible to make contact after death, he would do that. And he had left secret codes that only they would know, so they would understand that it was absolutely him. And they said that Houdini's wife waited 10 years. She did try and have contact with him. She would kind of occasionally go to like seances and go into dark rooms and try and go into trance to make contact with him. And after 10 years, she said something to the effect of, well, that's long enough to wait for any man. But on the flip side of that, and this was part of the story, the flip side of that is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, after he died, his wife Lady Doyle claimed to actually make contact with him in a seance. Mm-hmm. So they just had very differing views, and it's kind of interesting how they had been friends in the original kind of pursuit of what could be out there, and then fell apart when it came down to the brass tacks, really.
Yeah.
Now, I grew up in an era in the 60s and 70s, and we always had seances and games. I've never been in a seance at work. But we did play this game called Stiff as a Board, Light as a Feather.
Oh, yeah.
You remember that game where you could actually, with just your fingertips, levitate someone, and that was pretty cool. Yeah. So, no, I've never had a successful Ouija board or a successful seance, but I still have always believed in spirituality and that spirits exist. As a matter of fact, after my father died, I know for a fact he came to me. He directed my actions for like a day and a half. And it was a very traumatic period, but he needed things to be done. And I was the one that lived by him. And so I was the one he made go do them. Mm-hmm. Went into his house in the middle of winter in Minnesota, and it was all his heat was off and it was frozen. And the shower had shattered. It got so cold, and the house had been filled with fleas, and it was just a mess. And I had no intentions of going there, but I just had this overwhelming need to go there. My
Mm-hmm.
wife will even verify that when I walked in, the place was a disaster, and it was 5 miles from my house, and it was all him.
Mm-hmm.
There are numerous other things that he did. He literally controlled me for about a day and a half
Mm-hmm.
and made me do things. And I always believed in things like that prior to that, but that was a real convincing for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I completely believe that. I mean, I think that's probably what set me on the path of even being interested in the paranormal, is having paranormal experiences myself. Encounters that were unexplained,
Yeah.
Ghostly figures, touches, dream visitations from dead loved ones with messages that I was supposed to relay, even if I didn't understand them.
But
And
you lucky duck, you managed to wriggle travel into that.
well, I grew up in a household that was very conducive to witchery and the occult. I mean, my mom has always been very interested in the occult and the esoteric. I grew up, learning to read tarot. I had I knew my astrological chart before. I mean, it's in my baby book. It's on my how much I weighed, what day I was born, and my astrological chart. So I was exposed to this kind of thing at a very young age, and spending time in cemeteries. There were a lot of things. Not to say that we were the Addams family, but there was an understanding.
I love the Addams family.
I would love to say that that's exactly how it was. But my dad
That would be great,
definitely
wouldn't it?
not. My dad's not in that camp at all. He grew up in the south of Texas in a small town, and he's not shut off to it, but it's definitely not his forte.
No, it wasn't my father either. He was a very strong Christian though, and I think that's where the connection came. Is he didn't really believe in ghosts or spirits or seances or any of that. He was a little too right wing for that.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a very, very devout Christian, and there was nothing in the Bible in his mind that wasn't true.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not that way myself. I'm a Christian, but
But if you're willing to accept that, then you kind of have to accept that there's things we can't see or explain. So
even though your mind won't allow you to admit it, the fact is that you truly do expect it, are aware of spirituality and spirits and the existence of an
everlasting and that's a connection, life. Right? That's a connection between all religions, really, is that kind of, and when you look at even, old myths, and you look at the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians, there was this constant pursuit of understanding whatever this higher power or whatever this other world is, and whatever is going to happen on the other side of that veil. Mm-hmm. And then occasionally we can dabble in over there and gain knowledge from that. And that is sort of the root foundation. Spiritualism wasn't a new concept that you could, make contact with the spirits, but it was also the idea that you could make contact with the spirits and they would give you direct messages that would help you improve your life. And that's kind of the foundation of what became the New Age and metaphysical movement that we know today, was the idea that these messages aren't just arbitrary, and they're not just for, the occasional guy on top of a mountain with a tablet, right? They're actually these direct messages that can help you just make better decisions and figure out your way in the world. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, makes sense.
Okay.
Right. And, in Varla, mine was just the opposite of you. My dad was very spiritual, but it was more of a Native American or pagan, because it was like he revered nature and the trees. And we had a family of hawks that nested every year that, you didn't touch the tree with the hawks in them because you might disturb them and everything. And my best friend next door's mother was Wiccan. under the table Wiccan.
Oh,
if
under
my
the
mother,
table.
yes,
like
because had my mother known that she read my tarot when I was 7, she would have. My mother will not watch the movie Dogma to this day because Alanis Morissette plays God, and God is not a woman. I do too. I love it, but she was raised Southern Baptist and Pentecostal.
Okay.
So so like I said, my dad was much more open, because I remember getting in trouble in Sunday school when I was about 8 years old for asking questions. And when my mom picked me up, the Sunday school teacher told her, you need to talk to her. She asks too many questions. So I got fussed at all the way home. And then when I got to my dad, he's like, well, what did you ask? And I told him, he said, don't you ever stop asking questions.
Oh, well, that's nice.
So like I said, so I had kind of a balance in everything. So I think he's why I'm as open as I am and everything. So so it's great. It's great. I mean, and my mom's great too. We're on different spectrums, when it comes to beliefs and everything.
Everybody's different. I mean, I respect the spirituality that your dad had with the hospice and stuff. Now, if it me, I would be totally in line with that, but my dad would have walked away going, oh boy.
Right. Yes.
He was from that era.
Absolutely.
But we all grow and expand. And, to be honest, you told me I was going to be talking to Varla Ventura, and I'm like going, wow, I like goth people. I'm expecting dark.
I do have a wig, if that helps, Joe. I can play the part. We're expecting Elvira, perhaps.
That's awesome.
We don't require near that much cleavage on this show.
Yeah,
no.
That's for another show. Yeah.
Right.
I'm kidding. I really didn't have any expectations at all. I'm pleasantly surprised. You're very knowledgeable about your subject matter, and I think it's great. Without people opening people's eyes about these things, it always stays a mystery. And the fact that you spent time researching it and are so well spoken that you can articulate it, that's awesome.
Except for when I forget the name of Mrs. Piper, but
Oh, geez, I'm terrible with names.
You just got to roll with it sometimes. Even I actually always have to keep my books on hand because, you write something, and if you're a writer, you understand. So you write it, and then especially if you are in the zone when you write it, write it and you're super enthusiastic, and then it just you just move on to the next thing, and then you go back and you go, oh. Wow, I love that part.
I've had people ask me about parts in books, and I'm just like, I don't remember that part. I'm sorry, I have to go back
I really, honestly, I feel like
sorry.
I feel like a lot of people when they're writing are channeling it. Because some of the fantasy, we were talking about fantasy earlier, I can read that, and the way that they're describing things like empathy that I've lived with all my life, it's like they know. It's not just that they're writing this. They have pulled that from somewhere. And I think a lot of times, I actually had a client one time. She was a feng shui consultant. She was a social worker for like 10 years and got burnt out. And her solution was to go to Japan and study with a feng shui master. So when she came back over here, that's what she did for a living, is she would go to offices, of businesses and set up their offices and everything. And we were talking about meditation, and I'm like, I have a lot of trouble with meditation because I can't clear my mind. I said, I'll start out perfect quiet, and then all of a sudden, okay, this needs to happen, that needs to happen. Exactly. Yeah. And she asked me, she said, well, what do you do? Is there something that you do that you get so into that nobody can pull you out of it? I said, well, sometimes when I read, I said, but if I'm painting or drawing or, anything like that, I said, yeah. She goes, that is meditation also. So I think writing also falls into that.
I'm that way.
Because you get so focused in on it that's your meditative state. And
you really do enter into another world, right? What depending on what you're working on, but even if you're researching a specific subject, you can, as long as you can stay focused, you can get very, very focused. And I always find it so interesting too, just just in talking with other writers, it's always so interesting when you share things or people read your work and what they remember from it and how they interpret it. Because it's not necessarily, it might not even be what you meant, right? But they take it a different way. And I think of that also as an avid reader, as I'm reading someone's work, it's forming, that kind of picture. And I actually think that that's a really important aspect of fairy tales and folklore in particular, is that kind of ability. As you said, it's a form of meditation. Someone's telling a story and you're transported. Someone might be telling you the most fantastical story about the giant beanstalk, and yet in your mind you're kind of buying it, right? You're climbing this beanstalk. And I think it does something. I don't know what the technical term is of what it does in our brains, but it does something that frees our minds. And I think that's really key for us to remain inventive as humankind and problem solve. And whether it's in your daily life or on a global scale, you have to have that sort of like getting lost. And I think that if you want to get like really meta about it, when you think about going into the fairy realm or another world or a state of meditation or a suspension, that is really that kind of moment when the door unlocks. And so it almost, I'm not saying these things weren't and aren't tangible things that people have experienced in terms of like fairy encounters or paranormal encounters. But when you're retelling these stories and you're hearing about these stories, there is this idea that entering into that cave and going within metaphorically is actually freeing you to recharge and do the work that you need to do afterwards in the light. So stories are important.
I agree with that. That's like what you were saying about the focus when you're meditating or writing a book, or that also leads to the forgetfulness of what you've done in the past, because I write multiple genres. So when I'm writing this book with new characters, new plot lines, new goals, what's back there has to stay back there, because I can't bring that back up into this, because that's going to ruin the product.
Sometimes it bleeds, though. And there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to go with it.
I have a few out there where the stories took over and wrote themselves, and that's a beautiful thing when you can get it.
Yeah,
it is. It really
other times it's just putting words on paper and making them read well. But there's a few out there that it just really, really wrote itself, and that's that makes it all worthwhile.
Yeah.
I recently had one of I've been working on some fiction, and I had one of my characters wake me up. She was right over the bed, and she said, "You need to get up." And I was like,
"Finish the story."
She's a little bit detestable, this character, but I actually did not know who she was at the time. I just knew her name, and I had a description of her, but I really didn't know what she wanted. And she made me get up, and it was like probably 2-3 in the morning. I got up, I started writing, and I got not very far down the page when I realized that she was something very, very different than who I thought she was. And it was just kind of like, see, told you. So, she's a serial killer, it just turns out. I really thought I was going to write something really sweet and pleasant, and it actually turned into something darker than my darkest thoughts. So
okay, I've decided.
I've never had that happen, but I do have a book that won't let me write a sequel. Every time I tried to write a sequel, it
just won't let you.
Down. Yeah, that's Sunny that Morgana told me she read, and it's just. It's a standalone book, and every time I've tried to continue the story, because I absolutely love the story,
it's a beautiful story. I mean, it just is, and everything. That was when that was the first book I read by Joe, and like I said, I laughed, I cried, it was awesome. It really was. I mean,
it's a very special story to me. It's actually my dad's personality in the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee is the protagonist.
Oh.
And,
fantastic. It really and when I was younger, it things had way more of an impact. And I find now, as I've gotten older, it's more of the nonfiction. But like I said, every once in a while, a story comes along that touches me that way, and that was one of those stories. I mean, it was fantastic, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank
Let's
you.
plug you, though.
yes. Well, and I was fixing to get back onto that. So,
I know.
Yeah, I was reading one of your books about. It's been a couple of weeks ago, and I'm from Mississippi, so you've got a little ghost story about Natchez in one of them, the King's Tavern.
Oh, let's see. Is that in the Paranormal Parlor? I think it might be.
And the Books of the Bazaar.
Oh, well, the only thing I can remember about the King's Tavern, is that the one where the bartender knocks the drinks over? Actually, I think that's one in, I think I'm mixing that up with one in Colorado. There's a bar in Colorado where it's said to be, it's really near the Stanley Hotel, and it's said to be the spirit of the woman who was the bartender, used to knock people's drinks over because she actually was a prohibitionist.
Oh, okay.
But I don't think that's the Natchez one. The only thing I can remember about Natchez is this really silly law about not feeding elephants peanuts.
Oh, okay. Because there's some stupid laws. They've never been taken off the books, and you're like, somebody needs to sit down one day. And it's not just Mississippi. There are those stupid laws.
There's
everywhere.
A whole chapter in the, I believe it's in the first book of the Bazaar, that is dedicated just to, I researched weird law, and I don't even know if they're all still on the books, because that was written a number of years ago. But I found that completely like totally arbitrary things, like something about, I think it was in Oklahoma, it was some sort of law about the ocean, and it's landlocked. It was just like, what is happening here? This doesn't make any sense.
There's one somewhere that you cannot feed a goat ice cream on the street. And I'm like, okay.
Well, that's fair.
Okay, but who did that?
Somebody did it, right?
Yes.
It's like the person who drank the cup of coffee and didn't know it was hot, and so now all the lids have to tell us that they're hot.
That's always annoyed me.
Yes.
I know, it's so annoying.
We had a law in the books in Minnesota where you could not drive with a bear in your back seat.
Dead or alive.
And honestly, I can't argue against that. I don't think.
No, you shouldn't.
Joe,
if you get caught with a bear in the back seat, there's a chance you don't have a leg to stand on.
If you have a car that actually holds a bear, I mean, like that in itself is impressive.
Yes.
Maybe a big truck. Can you have one in the back of your truck? Probably. Yeah.
Yes.
That's really fine.
Okay. Joe, I did find it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
King's Tavern, Natchez, Mississippi, dates back to the late 1700s, when a woman named Madeline, the mistress of Richard King, was murdered by his jealous wife. For more than 200 years, the tavern's patrons have reported hauntings, including the ghost of a woman standing in front of them, angrily poised with hands on her hips. And in the 30s, they found the skeleton of a woman sealed in a brick fireplace with a dagger in her chest.
That's right. Right. I do remember that story now. It had been purported to be haunted for all of those years, and then they eventually found what they think was a female skeleton in the walls. Very Edgar Allan Poe, I thought that was.
Yes. And listen, I love the way that's written.
Video or something like that. Trying to think of the one where he bricked up his buddy.
The cast of Amontillado, Yep. His friend. He bricks his friend up.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was an intense.
That's a dark one. Yeah.
And I had the big volume with all the tales and poems, and there was one in there called The Sphinx, and I was reading that, and I was just really intrigued by this monster that was coming down the hill at him, and he described it so well. Well, then it turns out to be a fly that he was looking at too closely.
Oh, like is he looking through a microscope?
Well, he's looking through a window and he's
Oh, he's
seeing
looking
the
through a
streets
window.
walking down the hill.
Yeah.
It's actually a fly
I
on the
think he had a
window.
bit of a sense of humor. Yeah.
Look, when I was a
So,
sophomore in
he
high
had a
school,
sense of humor.
yeah, when I was a sophomore in high school, I had the best English teacher. He and I both read, so he would always recommend books. As a matter of fact, he's the one who got me reading Frank Herbert. And he made each one of us, when we were studying poetry, stand up and orally recite a poem. And he gave me The Raven.
Oh.
And there were people next to me that had like 4-line poems. And
You're
I'm
like, once upon a midnight jury, while it pondered weak and weary.
Exactly. And I'm like, what did I do? He goes, oh, I know you can do it. I'm like, well, thank you. I appreciate that you have that confidence in me. And I did, because I like Poe. But
do you still know it?
Oh no, good gosh, no. I mean,
only when I listened to Alan Parsons.
But yes, I do like the way that the Bazaar books are written, because it's little short chunks. So I can, like, when I'm at break, pull it up, read a couple of them, and move on to the next thing. So that's awesome.
The Book of the Bazaar and Beyond Bazaar were both inspired by, I spent a lot of time reading those Ripley's Believe It or Not type books as a kid. And I always loved those. And I also loved the Fate magazine and the little collections of ghost stories and people's kind of like unexplained encounters, coincidences, all that kind of stuff. And so those books were really inspired by that. And I just am that kind of person that kind of collects like weird miscellaneous knowledge. And one time I think I was at like a party and I had written a couple of other things, but they were kind of more like work for hires, and it wasn't really anything that I was very interested in. And someone said, oh, that'd be, why don't you put that in a book? And I pitched it, and they went for it. And they went for another one because I had so much left over, because then we had to cut it somewhere. And they were a lot of fun to write, and just kind of interesting to research. And I like books like that myself, that you can just kind of dip in and out of. And even some of the other books, the Banshees, Werewolves and Vampires, and the Paranormal Parlor, and the Fairy book, they are actually series of short stories. And if you read the book beginning to end, you might get a little secret something I put in there, but you can also just dip in and out of the stories and the way that they've been designed, which I'm very fortunate for that the designer, the publisher, really kind of was able to kind of set it up so that it was visually pleasing, and you could actually see the beginning and end of each section, just the way it was designed. So they do have all these kind of little snippets and stories and stuff. Yeah.
Well, my OCD won't let me jump around. I have to start at the beginning and finish at the end. And I've actually got the other two downloaded so that I can read those and everything.
Great.
So
yes.
If my Kindle ever
appreciate
dies,
that. Thank you thank you so much for supporting the arts.
Yes. I mean, like I said, it took me a long time to move from paper books to digital. I mean, it took me about 4 years, because that feel of a book in my hand, and I still love that. But, you can't carry 5 or 6 books around in your purse, to go to the doctor's office. Whereas, with the Kindle, you can. But my husband laughs at me, because last count, I keep a library of, what I have on my shelf, and I have over 1,000 books. And he's like, you haven't read all of them. I'm like, no, but I will. Just leave it alone. I will never read everything that's on my Kindle, ever. There's no way. Yeah.
I think the reason that I default to actual paper books still is that I spend a lot of time. I also do a lot of freelance editing. I've worked with some pretty renowned witches on their books and things like that. And so I spend a lot of time on the computer for my, throughout the day, and for my own writing, for editing. And so for me to be able to relax, I need to not be on the computer, because if I'm on the computer, I do feel like I should be doing something such as writing or somehow being productive.
Mhm.
So I think that's why I just have always stuck with the paper books, because I'm already on too many devices as it
Mhm.
is throughout the day, and I just kind of need that like disconnect for
My eyes were going bad, and when I got my first Kindle, I started to read again.
because you could increase the font size. Yeah,
Well,
I just got one for my dad
it
actually. Yeah.
wasn't giving me a headache. It wasn't making me tired. I would pick up a book, and where I would pick up a book and read, stay up all night reading it, and I would pick up books that were 1,000 pages. I mean, but I just couldn't anymore. It was just too hard to stay focused.
Yeah.
And then I got a Kindle, and that changed. And now I am just absolutely into Audible. Do you have any
I was
Audible
just
books?
gonna say that. I said I actually just kind of in the last couple of years have gotten more into audiobooks, in particular
I love them.
because Joe, I live in Minnesota.
Do you?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. I live north of St. Paul. Where do you live?
I
You don't
grew
tell
up
me
in
your address.
I grew up in Minneapolis. I was in the Linden Hills neighborhood,
Okay.
west side of Harriet. I wasn't on the lake. And now I live in a little town called Starbucks, Minnesota. That's west of the city. It's about 130 miles.
And there's a prairie. There's a park there right over by Starbucks. That is
Glacier Lakes. Yes.
That's my favorite park in Minnesota.
Oh, you're gonna have to let me know when you're up
next
here.
time I
I'll take
love
you out
that park.
on the boat fishing.
Yeah,
You like
I
to
love
fish?
that park. I don't.
Do you like to go for boat rides and
Yes, I do like to go on lakes. Yes.
See, you're like me. My husband's a fisherman, and I'm like, no, no.
I mean, I like the being on the boat aspect of it. Like I love that, and I like the peacefulness of it.
Yeah.
But
it's Jill and my favorite thing to do is to go on the lake.
Nice.
We use fishing as an excuse, and if we catch them, that's great. But just the piece of being on the lake or river or whatever, and Minnesota's a perfect place for that.
I've only lived here for a few years, and actually I got into audiobooks more because my sister pretty much exclusively does audiobooks, and she said just try it. And so I don't like get information as well when it comes that way for me, when it's audio only. However, I do like to go on long walks by the lake, and there's nothing like listening to a beautiful horror story on a November afternoon when no one else is out and the wind is blowing and you're walking by a lake. And so it's really actually helped me as a writer appreciate another aspect of writing, descriptions, dialogue, all of those kind of things, because reading it is different than hearing somebody say it, and you'll just catch like the perfect turn of phrase, and then because I burned through all the true crime murder podcasts. I just burned through them all. I was I binged them all. And then it's like after a while, it's just, the true crime just kind of like starts weighing on you. So I have a few that I like to listen to, but more and more I'm just listening to beautiful, dark fiction.
Do you have any on Audible, like your fiction work?
I don't know. I actually have no idea. I do not think that that I am on Audible. It's something that in my contract, the publisher handled, okay. And I don't believe any of my books ever ended up on there. I never looked myself up on Audible. It's never occurred to me.
I'll be looking you up tonight.
I would think they would have told me if they sold the audio rights, because that's in the contract, but maybe I don't know.
Maybe you have the right to make audio books.
Maybe I do. I'm pretty sure I don't. I'm pretty sure I signed my soul away when I.
Well, that's awesome.
You know how it is when you first start out. You'll sign anything.
I do. There's a little fact about Minnesotans. Maybe it's not a fact. You might prove me wrong. When we travel and people ask where we're from, most people, like if you're from Philly, you'll say Philly. If you're from LA, you'll say you're from LA, or Seattle, you're from Seattle. Minnesotans are always I'm from Minnesota.
Yeah.
We never name our city.
Yeah, I've noticed
We
that. I
always
have noticed
name
that.
our state, and that's
Yeah.
it's kind of, it's like we're the ones that are brave enough.
Yeah, I measure my time. So I grew up in California, and I have lived here. Well, I'm going on my 6th winter, Joe.
Oh, I'm proud of you. I'm proud.
Yeah,
of you.
including the polar vortex. So we're in.
It's a good place to write in the winter.
You know what? I have written more living here than I've written than I wrote in years in San Francisco. I mean, I wrote 6 books while I lived in San Francisco, but that that's a different kind of it was something I pitched. I had an idea. I wrote it. 2 of the books actually I wrote here, I believe. Yeah, actually. The Fairy book I finished here. I started it in San Francisco. The Fairy book I finished here, and Paranormal Parlor I wrote here. So yeah.
Because I actually make more money off my Audible books than I do off my print books.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well now I feel like hire a voice actor or something.
I know a couple.
There are a lot of them out there. I think Hadley spent a weekend listening to different ones before she picked somebody for hers.
It's like, and that will kill a book for me. If I hear the wrong voice, I'm just instantly like, nope, I don't care what the story is.
We were actually discussing that before you came on. I said back when they were doing book on CD, I had a horrible, horrible experience. It was an Anne Rice book.
Oh no.
And yes. And it took place in Mississippi and Louisiana. And there was a child ghost. And this guy not only had a horrible Southern accent, he had a horrible Cajun accent.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
I got just a few chapters into it. And I'm like, no. And it was 20 years before I would even attempt to listen to another audiobook.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's some doozies out there where, anytime an adult does a child's voice.
Yes.
That's like pretty much like,
right.
And eject.
Yes. My voice actor just finished my first book of a 9-book series, Splinter, and he did the female voices in there so well. Yeah. And it's not just one female voice for every woman. I mean, there's several of them, and Neil Orango, he just did an excellent job of the female voices and the different voices, and so.
Oh yeah, like the guy who my son loves to listen to he's read them all, but now he's interested in listening to all the Harry Potters, and those have been on Audible forever, and they were books on tape once upon a time.
I've never read them.
The guy, I never read them until I started reading them with my son like 2 years ago, and then that was like that. I was like, wow, these are actually really, really. They're very well written.
Okay. Yeah, they're
very well written, and they're great on Audible because the guy does the most fantastic voices. He's just great at voices, and so it's very pleasurable to listen to. It's, makes the time go.
I could listen to Tim Gerard Reynolds read the obituary.
I have a friend that is a huge Stephen King fan. And I love him as a writer. To me, his movies rarely translate because they just can't get the details into his full-length novels into a 2-hour movie. But he said every once in a while, Stephen King will narrate his own audiobooks, and he goes, it's horrible.
That's what my sister said too. She does not she prefers him not to read his books.
Yes, that's what my friend said too.
I liked his early stuff, his latter stuff since it just hasn't impressed me. But I mean, Cujo was awesome. The Stand was incredible.
Oh, well, I think in terms of the books that were made into effective movies, some of his shorter stories and novels, or like the shorter novels, definitely like Misery, and obviously The Shining wasn't really that short. Those became really incredible movies, and I liked the new the
Green
part
Mile,
1 and part 2. Yeah, I like those, and I actually really like him as a writer. I love him as a short story writer.
Yes,
I love him as a short story writer. He wrote a collection not terribly long ago. I think it's called Full Dark, No Stars. And if you haven't read that one, it really harkens back to some of those Skeleton Crew type stories. And I really, there's something in that art of the short story that he's very, very masterful at. So I really like him as a short story writer. And, you know, some of the novels I get a little lost in, but the thing that I love the most is his book on writing. I love his book on writing. It's just full of good ideas.
Yeah,
it really is. Yeah, it's just called On Writing. Stephen King, On Writing. Yes, and it's all the writers I know repeatedly use it as a reference. The writing group that I'm in, we talk about some of the exercises in there. Because it's really about, it's not about the generative part of writing so much, the trance part of writing. It's about the revision part of writing, which is, as we know, very much part of the writing process. Sometimes a little bit more painful, sometimes more fun, but still part of the writing process. And he talks about that kind of, you know, the second and the third draft and where you can go with it. It's really, it's a great book.
Is your reading group or your writing group, is that a physical group that you go to?
Yes, well, we started actually during the pandemic, so we've been Zoom, and then we finally were able to first we all got together outside at someone's house.
I'm going to throw a name out there, and this is just a hunch. Dieta Miller.
No.
Okay.
No.
I have a sister-in-law who writes.
Oh.
Down in St. Anthony, Minneapolis area.
Okay.
And she's very good, and she is in writing groups. So when you mentioned the writing group north of St. Paul, I thought, boy, there's a chance.
Oh, yeah, and there's a wonderful writing center, The Loft in Minneapolis. So once it opens back up again, I imagine we'll
sure.
Yeah, I mean, it ends up being a small world, especially once they start having writing classes and events, and they have a whole festival. So
That's awesome. All right, guys. Well, it looks like we're getting about to that time and everything. Miss Varla, can you tell us what you're working on and where everybody can find you at?
Yeah, I'm actually working on a little podcast called Midnight Stories with Varla Ventura. And it's just sort of shorter little stories that I'm recording, not unlike the story that I told you tonight about Patience Worth and the story about Emily Grant Hutchings. But there's some of the things that I've written about in my books, some of the things I've learned more about since I wrote the book. So there's follow-up stories about werewolves, stories about really interesting people who wrote about werewolves, witches, all different kinds of creatures that go bump in the night, and esoteric stories and paranormal stories, and just kind of midnight stories to keep you up is what I think of it, instead of awesome. Bedtime stories for to tell in the dark. So I'm working on that. It's not quite launched yet, but you can go to my website. It's varlaventura.net. And I do have a subscribe. You can subscribe to my newsletter, which is something I used to do really regularly. And then I just got so busy with other things, I stopped doing it. And I just really feeling lately like I need to get back to at least a monthly newsletter full of weird things and fun things. And then I launched a little shop on there. You can get Varla Ventura mugs and the one I'm drinking from here. And also because the covers of my books are so beautiful, which I don't take credit for. I did not create them. Incredible designers and artists did them. I put those on mugs and tote bags and things like that. And awesome. And then just kind of adding weird things like a changeling onesie for little babies and, various things like that. So
that's fantastic. Yeah. And I have subscribed to your website recently.
Oh, great. So hopefully you'll get a newsletter from me. And then I am working on a couple of other books. One is actually about it's kind of in line with the fairy book, in that the fairy book is an exploration of creatures in folklore. And this is an exploration of plants and fairy tales, plants and folklore. And it's kind of like a mixture of botany and lore and why plants appear in certain stories and what they do and sometimes what they represent, and magic and medicine and all that fun stuff. So,
website she mentioned, is that like a YouTube channel, or is that?
I don't have a YouTube channel.
Okay.
I'm actually was just told I need a YouTube channel, so stay tuned for that. But no, it's just a real regular website, varlaventura.net.
Okay.
And if I do get a YouTube channel, I'll put a link to it on there.
I'm going to look you up because I have thoroughly enjoyed talking to you tonight.
Oh, same.
And I knew it was going to be good, but this was a lot better than I even expected. So
thank
I
you.
think you're a great person, and I'm gonna look up your work and give you a little.
We'll have tea together at some point.
I would like that.
See, then you could do
I'm not opposed to a scotch.
Or a scotch, yeah, me either.
See, you could do a face-to-face interview too.
Yeah.
We could.
In real life. Yeah.
That would be awesome. All right, great. Well, it was so good to have you, and we would love to have you back anytime.
Absolutely.
You're
my
available.
Pleasure. Yeah.
Yes. And like I said, we'll be in touch, and I will let you know when we get this posted.
Great.
Everyone, don't forget to subscribe and to like. And until next time, stay weird.
Easily done.
Before you go, be sure to leave us a comment and let our weird team know how they're doing. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us to get notifications when we add new content. We are adding new content 3, 4, and sometimes 5 times a month. If you want to keep the conversation going or would like to learn more about our panel of hosts, be sure to check out our link tree. That's linktr.ee/Weird Realities. It links to our official Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and website.